It ain't the left side or the right side, then it must be the FinSiders. It ain't the left
Welcome
side,
back, Dolphins fans, to another
right
episode of
side.
On the FinSide. Today we are sitting down to talk about the draft with former FinSiders host and currently on 790 The Ticket and 560 WQAM down in Miami, Greg Likens. Greg, welcome back to the show. We haven't had you on a while. How's everything been going for you?
Everything's great, Paul. Yeah, good to be back on. Always good to talk to you. And I'm glad that we have the draft out of the way because we had all those questions and now we have answers to them.
So for only having 6 or 7 picks, this was a really, really active draft for the Dolphins, it felt like. Did you get the same sense? And what was your favorite move out of all the different ones that we had?
Oh, man. Well, I think everybody will be disappointed if I don't say the Josh Rosen trade, right? I mean,
True.
That's the one that at least has garnered the most attention. But just in general, you know, if we move away from just the actual picks themselves and look at the philosophy employed by Chris Greer, I know that this year's draft, they end up with the 6 picks and, of course, Rosen, but I like the way that they've set themselves up for the future. And I know that it's difficult for some Dolphins fans to realize that in some ways this year's draft, even the upcoming season, is about building towards the future. But since that is kind of the way things are, I like the idea that he set themselves up and the Dolphins up to have a lot of flexibility and maneuverability in the 2020 draft. And from what he described, it sounds like that's what he wants it to be like every year, where he's got multiple picks. He can move around if he wants. He can make all the picks, but next year is looking like they're going to have somewhere between 12, 13, 14, somewhere in that range, depending on the compensatory picks. And so bigger picture, I like the fact that they've created flexibility for themselves in the future.
And that's one of the things we've talked about a lot with all of our draft coverage going on. And one of the things that we noticed, and I want to hear if you get the same sense, is the Josh Rosen move almost feels like a win-win. You even if you take out the trade with the Saints to make it a little more palatable and what have you, the fact that if Rosen does well, they don't need to make that move up to get a quarterback. But if Rosen does poorly, they're probably already in position, so they still have all that flexibility out there with their draft picks, and they're probably picking top 5 if Rosen tanks. I mean, it just feels like the biggest win-win trade to me, regardless of how it pans out. Do you get the same sense, or?
I do mostly, and what's interesting is when the trade was first announced or reported, I was a little upset that they gave up a second-round pick for Rosen and then found out there was a 5th involved as well. But, you know, the benefit of time has helped me out because big picture, I know it was a late second-round pick, and also really the financial consideration in terms of the $6.24 million that you owe him over 3 seasons. I mean, that's nothing, you know, based on what you normally pay a quarterback in the NFL. So, to your point, I agree with you in the sense that you get now a year to see what Josh Rosen's all about. And you have the potential on the high end of things, if things go really well, to have figured out your quarterback position, something that they haven't been able to do in 2 decades, right? So that's one side of it. And then if it doesn't work out, to your point, they've stockpiled all the draft picks. If it's not working out, they're not going to win a lot of games, and they're still going to be able to do what we'd all anticipated anyway and go after their franchise quarterback in the 2020 draft when, for all intents and purposes, if we believe all the pundits, it's a much better quarterback class. So, you know, I would have liked them, you know, ideally to maybe give up a 3rd rounder for Josh Rosen because Arizona didn't have any leverage whatsoever. But big picture, if you give up a 2nd-round pick and a 5th rounder and you figure out the quarterback position, we'll look back on this trade and say it was a steal.
Absolutely. And so I know we've talked a lot of Josh Rosen, and I know we could both probably go on for an hour about him. Outside of Josh Rosen, Christian Wilkins, I believe you had the chance to talk with him already. Great 1st-round pick, in my opinion. I know the entire Clemson defense appeared to go in round 1, and if not, then in round 2. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts around Christian Wilkins.
Yeah, it's hard to see anything about this pick that would make you hesitant whatsoever. I mean, he is a home run on the field in terms of his production, and you know, an All-American. He's a finalist for the Bednarik, Gursky, and Outlet trophies. He 57 tackles, 6 sacks, 2-time national champion, and someone who off the field in the classroom is coming to the NFL with a pair of degrees and won the academic Heisman. And really, Paul, what stood out to me in talking to him, you know, half an hour or so after he was drafted, is that he's mature beyond his years, and he relishes the idea of coming to a young team, which the Dolphins are going to be, with a new head coach and kind of a restart in mind, that he's relishing the idea that he can come in and be a leader and help set the culture. And so, there have been many different draft picks over the years, and oftentimes you just open for a rookie that they can come in and contribute and on the field and do their job. But I think this guy's going to come in not only because they got a need there and be a very good player for him, but I think he's going to be a great presence in the locker room and in the community on top of all of that for Brian Flores and for the Dolphins organization. So I really like the pick. He's a really impressive young man. The only thing I would say is the draft board was playing out, and you saw who was picked before him. And this is all, prior to knowing they were going to trade for Josh Rosen. I was a bit surprised they passed up on Dwayne Haskins. Just the idea that he slipped to them at 13 and knowing the importance of that position, in the moment I was like, oh, man, this is a great opportunity. Maybe they go for Haskins. Obviously, based on their board, they really like Wilkins better. And then, the next day they go out and trade for Rosen. So it kind of makes sense. They got the quarterback. But, you take that part of it out of it. I think Christian Wilkins seems like, for all intents and purposes, he's going to be a home run.
Yeah, and it was funny. Leading up to the draft, we had our mock draft show, and we had four guests on. We all sat and we said what we would have done at the position, and then we had the person that actually picked. The four of us, based on how the board fell, took Christian Wilkins. The one person who picked, and I'm not letting him forget this, is my co-host Kat, and he went with an offensive lineman. So he was eating a little bit of crow after the fact when four of us all went ahead and said we'd take Christian Wilkins with the pick. So I feel good about that. But
I suppose the good thing in that exercise with the current state of the Dolphins roster is that you could really pick any position, right? And you're filling a need. So you can't really go too wrong. Sounds like three of you then were on board with what Chris Greer and the front office wanted to do.
So taking a look at the rest of the draft, the Dolphins did take Michael Dieter and then Isaiah Prince. So they did fill a little bit of that offensive line room, but there's definitely still room to grow in that room. But take us through your thoughts on Dieter and Prince. I know they're two very different individuals, but.
They are, yeah. And, it's interesting. With some of these picks, especially late in the draft, it's really hard to know one way or the other. It's kind of the ultimate crapshoot. But, let's start with Dieter in the third round. You love the fact that he started 54 consecutive games at Wisconsin, has played literally all three positions, tackle, guard, and center. And so with that background and knowing he's coming from a school that produces top offensive line talent, I think he's going to have the opportunity to come in and contribute immediately. And I'd be a little disappointed if he doesn't fill one of those guard roles for the Dolphins. Not that he's a great player per se, but it's a combination of his accomplishments in college and also the fact that they just really have no depth on the offensive line. So I'd love to see him come in, get the opportunity, and take advantage of it and be one of the starters. And then with Isaiah Prince, you have to like coming from Ohio State, being a 3-year starter himself at right tackle. That's a position of need for the Dolphins. In hearing some of the draft pundits speak about him, it sounds like they think he needs to develop a little bit more, but I think that's pretty good value in the 6th round to get a guy like that. Even if he can't come in and play right away, I'm sure they're going to allow him to compete. And hopefully down the line, they can develop him into a decent player. So they have many needs on offensive line. I really like Dieter. I think Prince may take him a little longer, but between those two picks, I think they're very productive for the Dolphins.
Now, just sticking on Prince for a minute, I'm just curious if you saw the same thing I did, which is, you look back at his junior year, he was a guy that looked like he was going to come out and be, first or second round lock. And then he seemed to be a guy that gets a very good initial pop, but doesn't keep his drive going at that point. And really, that seems to be one of the things that I would think would be fairly easy for an offensive line coach to work with him on. I mean, as far as issues, for a 5th round pick, it feels like a lesser issue to have to deal with. I mean, did you see the same thing, or did you see something different with him?
Well, I got to admit, I haven't broken down much of his film, Paul, so I'm going to rely on your expertise there. But I will say that just in general, in reading more about him, 2 years ago, it sounded like you're right. He was a world beater. And then, this last season he kind of regressed for whatever reason and wasn't as impressive, and then ultimately we see him fall in the draft. So clearly there's something up there, but I think that, you got to rely on this Dolphins new coaching staff, who's relatively new in terms of most of the guys are new for Brian Flores, going to work under him. I hope that they can get the best out of him because, you still have to be pretty darn good to start for 3 years at a school like Ohio State and what they were able to produce on the offensive end of the field. So, I think he's got some upside, but clearly there's a reason why he fell the way he did. So I think that's worth monitoring to see what they can get out of him.
Now, looking at linebacker Andrew Van Ginkel, I know he was not on a lot of people's radars. I know there were a lot of defensive players, but everybody seems to be warming to the idea immensely as they watch more film on him. What did you see out of Van Ginkel when you took a look?
Well, man, I listen, between him and Dieter, the 2 games that Wisconsin played in the Bowls the last couple of years against University of Miami, I mean, they both played well. And, Dieter helped the offensive line run for over the running game run for over 300 yards in the Pinstripe Bowl against Miami in Mark Richt's last game. And then Van Ginkel made a couple of nice plays, including an interception against the University of Miami. So, I'd heard their names just because of the connections to the local team here in South Florida. And with him, it seems like more than any of these other players, he's kind of a scheme fit for what Flores and the defense wants to do in terms of if they're going to play that hybrid kind of 3-4, the outside linebacker, because I know there were other names that a lot of Dolphins fans expressed on social media to me and even some of the local people that I interact with on the radio. They were like, hey, all these other guys they could have taken to get after the passer, but this is clearly someone that they've watched on film that they think will fit what they do. And, it may get a little tired. We've done this a lot this offseason talking about the New England Patriots connections, but, how many times have the Patriots rolled out their defense especially, and it's a bunch of no-name guys that maybe we don't know that much about or haven't been hyped up, and next thing you know, they're winning another division. So I trust that Brian Flores, especially with the influence from New England, knows how to evaluate this defensive talent.
So lastly, for the normal rounds of the draft, we had Myles Gaskins and Chandler Cox taken back-to-back. I love the whole back-to-back pick thing. I love how it can change the layout of an entire round when a team picks 2 in a row. What did you think of those 2 picks?
Well, you can't argue with Myles Gaskins' production at Washington, going over 1,200 yards in 4 consecutive seasons. I mean, that guy was versatile too, catch the ball to the backfield. So, I like what he's going to bring to the table in terms of being able to hopefully be part of that running back room with Kalen Ballage and certainly Kenyon Drake. And then, I was surprised. I don't know if everybody else was, but I was surprised when Chandler Cox's name was called, because I'm like, whoa, there's still fullbacks in the NFL,
Right.
But of course, then you look at the numbers and you see, James Devlin was on the field for the Patriots and Chad O'Shea for 36% of their snaps last season. It's like, okay, well, we're going to have our first fullback, I think, since Lusaka Polite for the Miami Dolphins. So I think, it's going to be different, but I like the idea of bringing in a hard-nosed, tough guy who can block and do a lot of things in the backfield. So I was certainly surprised, because you don't expect fullbacks to be drafted, but certainly in the 7th round, and hearing what Chris Greer and Brian Flores said after the draft, that he was their top-rated fullback. They wanted to make sure they got him, so they made sure they snatched him up and not let him get to free agency.
Now, looking at the undrafted free agents, I know Kat and I talked about them extensively, so I won't bore our listeners to death talking about them. Is there anybody that stands out for you, and do you see many of those guys making the team? Because the opportunities seem to be there right now.
Well, that's I think the big point that a lot of people know, the Dolphins fans who follow the team so closely, but I think more so than any year, this is going to be a year in which these undrafted rookies have an opportunity to come in and make a real impact. I apologize, I don't have some of the names in front of me right now, but I know that let's see, there's one of the linebackers out of Maryland, Trey Watson. There we go.
Yes.
I think he's got a really good opportunity just from watching him in college and then knowing that they've got needs to get better and certainly more athletic there in the linebacking core. And, there's a few others, but that's a guy, first of all, that stood out to me. And I just think that big picture, there's plenty of opportunity for these guys. Even the Northwestern cornerback, Montre Hardage, a player where, I was surprised that they didn't draft a cornerback. I mean, I wasn't expecting them to fill all the needs in a draft in which they only had, the 6 picks, but that's certainly still a need. And I think there's a great opportunity there because I know Eric Rowe's on the roster. I know that Micah Fitzpatrick potentially could play cornerback on the outside, but we don't know who's going to play opposite Xavier Howard, and they certainly need more bodies in the secondary. So I think those are the 2 of the guys that come to mind that have a chance to make an impact.
So anything else about this draft stand out to you before we get to our final question here?
Well, I think just in general, kind of getting back to the point I was making before, I like just how they've set themselves up for the future. And so, for all Dolphins fans out there, I think that if Chris Grier has his way on an annual basis, it's not going to be, hey, just 6 picks and then you move on and maybe you have to wait until day 3 to get most of the picks. It sounds to me like he wants to do what Bill Belichick and the Patriots do on an annual basis, where they go into a draft and they got 12, sometimes more picks, and they can move around or they can make their selections. Because let's be honest, I mean, the Patriots don't hit on all their picks, right? You look back, certainly they have some success, but I think what they do is they enhance their odds by adding all those picks. So for Chris Grier, it gives him more of an opportunity to potentially not hit on everybody because that's impossible, but provides flexibility that the percentages say that you're going to hit on a certain number of them. And if that's the case, then hopefully the Dolphins can start building through the draft more effectively than we've seen. Because, I was crunching the numbers a little bit, Paul, and looked at this. I mentioned this last year during draft time and then brought it back up this year during draft time. But if you look pre-2015, there's only 2 players still on this Dolphins roster who were drafted by the team. And it's Walt Aikens and Rashad Jones. Other than that, pre-2015, there are no other drafted players still on the current Dolphins roster. So, I mean, they just need to get more staying power out of these players. I don't care what round. Certainly the first, second rounders, you would hope so. But I think that's something that needs to change moving forward. And so big picture, I think that's my hope. And I'm optimistic that with Chris Grier now executing his plan, that'll be the case.
Yeah, and looking at the number of draft picks he's already stockpiled for next year, it certainly appears that it's going to be the case moving forward, which is a great thing to see. So, Greg, looking at our final question here, probably the most burning draft question of all. Who ends up sitting on the Iron Throne in Game of Thrones at the end of this? We've got 2 episodes left. Who is going to finally sit on that Iron Throne, if anybody?
Oh, my goodness. That's the question everybody wants to know, right?
We're holding you to it, so.
We can't call that the $1 million question. That's the multi-million, maybe $1 billion question. You know what? I've been thinking a lot about this, as I'm sure every Game of Thrones fan has. And, I'm not sure how creative the creators are going to get with this, but my gut feeling, especially after watching the last episode, is that it ends up being Jon Snow. But I don't know if that's too predictable. So I'm going to go with Jon Snow. Maybe that's hopeful on my part because I think he'd make the best ruler and king. But I also feel as I answer this question that they're kind of setting everybody up to think that would be the best scenario. And the show on the whole has thrived because they're willing to do what's surprising, what's shocking. So I'll go with Jon Snow, but I don't feel very confident about it.
No, I'm with you on that. It definitely felt like a shell game by the end of this past episode. Now, I'm rooting for Arya and/or the Hound to sit on the Iron Throne, but again, I don't think it's going to happen. It'd be amazing. I'd watch an entire offshoot of the Hound being on the Iron Throne, but it is what it is. So, anyway, Greg, thank you very. Oh, dude, it'd be amazing.
He'd just be, he'd get upset and he'd just start killing people and then, go back to normal.
Or they come in and complain about their problems to him. It'd be awesome. Just he'd throw him out of the castle if he doesn't beat him out the door. It'd be perfect.
Yeah, therapy with the Hound. There we go.
I'm telling you, he's going to have his own self-help book. So, anyhow, All right, folks, you've been listening to On the Fin Side. We've got Greg Likens here. We're going to have him back for another segment to talk about the offseason as a whole, look at the philosophy like we've talked about, and just kind of the state of the team. So if it's not on the right side, it's not on the left side, it is on the Fin side. So, Lodi, take us home.
It ain't the left side or the right side, then it must be the Fin side. It ain't the left side or the right side, then it must be the Fin side. Listen, Dolphins fans across the land all tuning in to see what Brian Cat and